Hey, what's up, guys? So today I kind of wanted to show you guys the independent rear suspension and kind of why stock bushings cause wheel hop. So yeah, we're gonna have Bruce. If you guys don't know Bruce, he owns Tilt Boogie Racing, and he developed his own bushing kit for it. So we're gonna demonstrate to you how crappy the stock rubber bushings are. So.
Hi guys, my name is Bruce, as Kyle said, and I'm the proprietor here at Tilt Boogie Racing. And we've got our little mock-up IRS assembly here to show you the differences between your stock rubber OEM bushings and the bushing kit that we developed, which contains Delrin bushings for the upper and lower control arms, UHMW bushings for the subframe, and also there's not a diff in here, but we take the rubber out of the front and rear diff mounts and we put solid aluminum in the front and Delrin in the rear diff mounts. This helps stabilize all the IRS components, which is going to lead to the elimination of wheel hop. This side of the IRS assembly we have OEM bushings, rubber bushings in the top upper control arms, and rubber OEM bushings in the lower control arms. And as you can see, this is a very stiff assembly. If I try to lift this up, I'm going to be lifting, the IRS assembly up off the floor, just trying to articulate the suspension. The rubber bushings do not rotate at all. What happens is, in the OEM bushings, the rubber simply twists inside between the inner sleeve and the outer sleeve of the bushing. So this is how your car is riding in stock configuration, which is kind of bouncy. A lot of people say, well, I don't want to put Delrin bushings in my car because it'll make the car ride stiffer. Well, actually, the complete opposite is true, because the smoother these control arms can articulate, the better your car is going to ride. If they're bound up in rubber, the car is not going to ride as good as it can ride if the control arms are articulating freely. The main thing that causes wheel hop is control arm deflection. And what happens is when power is applied through the differential into the half shaft and onto the wheel and tire assembly, this thrusts the knuckle assembly forward. And the soft rubber bushings compress on the front and they compress on the rear. The lower control arm is what causes most of the deflection. The upper control arm is much smaller, and the distances between the two bushings is much smaller, so the upper control arm does not play as big of a role. What happens is the wheel goes forward, and it can only go so far forward, and it compresses, and then it rebounds back. And the same thing happens to the tire. The tire spins and then grips, and then spins and then grips. And then during this operation, that's what causes the wheel hopping, because all these parts are unstabilized. Control arms are actually leaning forward and backward because the rubber has so much give in them. The subframe is also very important, because these rubber bushings, let me grab a crowbar and show you what happens in these rubber bushings, how soft they are. These are your rubber bushings, okay? So that's how the subframe is mounted in the chassis. When we go to the UHMW bushings, we make this connection much tighter and stiffer, and that almost acts kind of like a bolt-in roll bar when you put this on the back half of a SN95 chassis. SN95 chassis are much stiffer than the Fox body chassis, but they're significantly sloppier than the new and improved S197 chassis, which is why you want to stiffen up the back end of the chassis with the subframe with stiffer subframe bushings, and then also why it's so important to put subframe connectors on an SN95 car, particularly convertibles.
So why why should someone care about wheel hop? What can happen if the car wheel hops too much?
Well, if the car wheel hops too much, you're going to start breaking things. Half shafts and differentials are the actual weak links in the IRS, and those are the things that are going to be subject to breakage first. When these first came out in 2003, with the Terminators, they didn't have these kind of problems with the 01s and the 99s because those cars didn't have the kind of power. Once the Terminator come out with the supercharger, people were putting smaller pulleys on, cranking up the boost, putting aftermarket superchargers on, and coming up with 400, 500, and 600 and more horsepower. Well, this IRS assembly was not designed for that. That's why they came up with a Band-Aid, which was an IRS cover brace, and that was kind of like a reinforcing piece that reinforced the eggshell thin OEM cover, and it was kind of a Band-Aid. Now with the new Ford Racing reinforced diff cover, that has kind of eliminated the problem of the cover breakage. Until you stabilize all of these components, you can expect to continue to have issues with breakage with half shafts and differential covers, I should say. Okay, here's the OEM cover, and we just want to show you for demonstration purposes how thin this thing is. This is area where it mounts on the rear diff mount there on the subframe, and there's a bracket. This is your OEM. Let's see. Your OEM rear diff support bolts on like that. This is a rubber bushing. This rubber bushing allows the rear of the housing to twist a lot, and that's not good. The housing needs to be stabilized, so that's why we put solid aluminum bushings in the front, and then we have a Delrin isolated rear diff support that I probably should have here, but we'll get one at some point for the explanation of the differences. Now, this eggshell thin cover, as it's gyrating from all the power, it just can't take the stresses, and these have broken off of the back of the cover. You know, this mounting portion has broken out of the cover, and also it damages a lot of the half shafts. To show you the differences side by side, this is the new Ford Racing cover, and you can see how much thicker the flange is, how much thicker the meat is in the entire body, and they also have the jack screws for the bearing caps and the differential, just to hold them more stabilized. So this is definitely a huge improvement, and will end all your cover breakage issues, providing you stabilize the differential housing. Okay, here's the differences in the OEM and full tilt billet, Delrin isolated billet aluminum rear diff support. The factory unit is kind of a weldment, and it has a big rubber bushing here, which allows for a lot of differential movement. And the full tilt is a billet aluminum with a Delrin isolated bushing in it. So the Delrin has very little give to it, and the Delrin is going to help isolate a little bit of the NVH from transferring from the differential housing into the subframe. The front, unfortunately, we can't do anything about. These are the front OEM diff bushings, and they're rubber. And you can see they have a lot of give to them, especially when you have a lot of power. And the full tilt parts are basically solid aluminum bushings, and they can transfer a little bit of NVH into the subframe that you will hear in the passenger compartment, and particularly if your differential has a lot of miles on it or has a lot of abuse on it. But if it's recently set up or with new bearings and or new gears, you really will hardly hear the differential NVH.
And from as far as the NVH of those diff bushings, from me having the car, I barely notice. I can maybe hear it if I roll the windows up and really listen for it, but it's nothing, at least me personally, that bothers me at all. So if you guys are kind of worried about it, I personally wouldn't worry. So.
Okay, on to the full tilt boogie bushed side of this IRS. This is what the OEM subframe bushings look like when they come out of the subframe. They're kind of all chewed up. They're actually vulcanized into this metal sleeve. So once that's out, you're going to have a bunch of rubber residue left in there. And we just run a 2-inch diameter wire wheel through the bore of that and clean it up very nicely and prepare it for the installation of the UHMW subframe bushing and the aluminum sleeve. And we'll see here the differences in deflection compared to what we had on the other side. This is virtually no movement at all. UHMW is a little bit softer plastic than the Delrin, and we chose UHMW for a specific reason for this application. You can see how much stiffer this is in the factory bushing. So when this is bolted into your subframe, this is so stiff it almost kind of acts like a mini roll bar to stiffen the back half of the SN95 chassis. Now, if you remembered how much pressure it took to articulate the control arms in the OEM rubber, now we have the Delrin bushings. This assembly will not even support its own weight. In addition to smooth articulating suspension components, we also have zero deflection. When power is put into this wheel and tire and the pavement is put down to the ground, the wheel cannot push and deflect the control arm forward and backward, causing that oscillation for wheel hop. All these components are stabilized and the wheel hop will be eliminated. Usually in most cases it's 100%. In some cases it's depending on whether or not you have subframe connectors or whether or not you have a Cooper convertible. Those convertible cars, I like to call them special needs vehicles, and they need some extra help. They need a good subframe system with a matrix bracing, like something like Stifler's makes. That will stiffen the chassis on a convertible. There's also another thing that people put on these rear cantilevered brackets. They're called a Mathis brace, and I would avoid anybody to use them unless you have probably a convertible and you're still battling wheel hop. Then they may help you a little bit, but I'm not a big fan of the Mathis brace. Again, when your car is riding down the road, these control arms are much freer to follow any bumps or uneven pavement situations that you might encounter. This is actually going to make your car ride better if you're not changing the springs or the shocks. Obviously, when shocks start getting old, they need to be replaced. But if you're going to coilovers, now you're in a situation where you're going to be adding NVH, probably going into the chassis with the coilover mount, which is where the OEM shock originally mounted. That's going to be your coilover assembly, and where that mounts into the chassis, that has a tendency to create a little bit of NVH. So we hope that explains the IRS a little bit for people that are kind of new to the Cobra IRS. And the IRS was kind of an afterthought when they put them in these cars, but the Ford engineers thought it was a good idea, so they made this sub-assembly to fit in a chassis that's actually designed for a stick axle, and they came up with this and for the Cobra models because of the improved handling, and it also causes a much better ride than a stick axle.
So also, maybe kind of talk about, because the new 2015 Mustangs, how does that IRS as far as those bushings compared to the Cobra OEM bushings? How are those?
Well, the S550 IRS, which comes in all Mustangs 15 and up, it is a much better IRS design, but it still suffers from the same OEM rubber bushings and control arm deflection that the SN95 IRS suffered from. So again, even with the 550, although it's even an improved IRS and it's designed for the chassis, it still suffers from control arm deflection. So any place there's factory OEM rubber needs to come out. We have a kit for the S550. We have Delrin bushings in some places. We have spherical bearings in other places. But the main goal is to remove all of the rubber to eliminate the wheel hop. Because again, wheel hop in the 550 is no different than the wheel hop in the SN95. The more you hop the car with the wheel hop, the more damage you're going to do. We want the energy not to go to a wheel hopping scenario. We want the energy to get that put down to the pavement between the tire and the asphalt. Okay, one thing I'd like to address here is the half shaft retaining nut that attaches the hub to the half shaft. These have a tendency of coming loose, and when they do come loose, they can cause damage to the bearing. If they're run long enough in a loose condition, they can eventually damage the hub. And if they're run even longer than that, they can start doing damage to the knuckle assembly. So the main thing is, I would say for everybody that has an IRS in their car, buy yourself a 36 millimeter deep well socket and check the torque on this nut back here, either at every oil change or at least twice a year. The torque is 240 to 250 foot-pounds. If that nut starts coming loose a little bit, it's going to cause a little bit of a wiggle in the hub, and then the seal is going to have a hard time sealing the factory grease in the bearing, and you'll start seeing a dirty, sooty area on the back side of the knuckle. If you have that in your car, that's a sign that your bearing probably should be replaced. This is a maintenance item, and I would say if the torque is kept up on it, it's probably about a 75,000 mile unit. If you're going to the track and you're running on slicks, you could easily cut that in like 1/3 or 1/4. Every time you go to the track, whether it's a drag strip or a road course, check the torque on your half shaft retaining nuts. The other thing on the knuckle assembly are the upper and lower cross-axis joints. These factory rubber boots are kind of thin and they're kind of fragile, and they have a tendency to tear and rip. And that's not really a problem, but you want to really keep the road grime out of those. And so Full Tilt Boogie Racing has come up with a replacement boot for the OEM joints. The main thing is to make sure that your joint does not have any side-to-side play, which is in this case forward and rearward motion in the way it's assembled here. It's got to be tight. It can be loose. It's designed to be loose because this is how the toe is adjusted on the IRS. So it has to wiggle, but you don't want any forward or backward movement. If you just need boots, it's a good idea to replace the boots. The knuckle does not have to come off the car. All you got to do is mark your alignment location on the eccentric on the rear side, and then take it apart, replace the boots, put it back together, torque it back to 76 foot-pounds with your alignment mark at the bottom, or on your slot here, and you should be fine. Same thing on the bottom. If your joints are loose, if you ever lost control of your car and then slid into a curb or something, that's probably going to destroy your cross-axis joints. So if they're bad, we have replacements for them on our site, and they're really easy to replace. Again, the knuckle does not have to come off the car. We just got to disassemble each area, pull it away. We have tools that press these in and out for you, and that's another thing you guys got to keep an eye on with your IRS assemblies.
Cool.
All right.
So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. You can also contact Full Tilt if you have any more maybe technical questions on some of the other stuff, but I think you did a good job of kind of explaining everything with the car. And I've had his full kit, that Ford Racing diff cover, all the bushings. I'll leave a link down in the description of all the parts I put on. But what a huge difference! My car originally, when I bought it, I had the crappy rubber bushings, and I would wheel hop all the time, and eventually my diff started leaking. So then I went online, went to SVT Performance, and kind of looked around, and a bunch of people recommended Full Tilt, so I contacted them, and we put the bushing kit, and I've had it for I think two years, almost 3 years now, and what a world of a difference. The car feels so much more solid. When you go around a corner, there's no like mushiness or wondering what the car is doing in the back. It's super stiff. I like it. Like Bruce was saying, it rides nicer than the factory, because I mean, rides much nicer. So definitely a happy customer. So I can wholeheartedly recommend this kit for you guys. It'll solve your wheel hop problems, and then make your car handle better and drive nicer. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up. If you didn't, a thumbs down. And I'll see you guys in the next video.